Welcome. I'm Nina Chace. I direct the Center for Religious Freedom at the Hudson Institute. Today, I'm very enthusiastic to introduce our panel of distinguished experts on the Middle East. We will be addressing the Arab Spring 1 year on, and our panelists will be focusing on the political ascendancy of Islamist organizations, the impact on religious minorities in the region, and movements within the broader geopolitical and historical context. And I will introduce all the speakers now, and they will each make their presentation for 10, 15 minutes or so, and then we will have a question and answer period afterwards. Our first speaker is Walter Russell Mead. He is the James Clarke Chace Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College, as well as editor-in-large of the American Interest. He formerly taught at Yale University, where he taught the renowned Grand Strategy course. And he, I would like to say, is deeply respected as being a very fine teacher by his students. He has also, is also the author of Via Media blog at theamericaninterest.com, where he writes on a vast array of subjects. And I think what really distinguishes him as a foreign policy analyst is that he really does understand religion. There are many other accolades and achievements in his bio, but you all should have that on your chairs. Our next speaker is the research fellow at Hudson Center for Religious Freedom, Sam Tadros, who's been with us since the fall. And before coming to Hudson, Sam was a senior partner at the Egyptian Union of Liberal Youth, an organization that aims to spread ideas of classical liberalism in Egypt. He is also a professional lecturer at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. He writes regularly and is often quoted on religion and politics in his native Egypt in the international media. He writes regularly on Egypt's elections for NRO, and he has just returned from a month in Egypt. Our final speaker will be Kurt Muller, and Kurt, before joining the Center for Religious Freedom at Hudson, also in the fall, he was associate professor of history at Azusa Pacific University, and before that, Geneva College. And he has published with American University and Cairo Press in 2010, a book on Coptic identity and Ayyubid politics in Egypt from 1218 to 1250. He received his PhD from the University of California, Santa Barbara, focusing on the non-Muslim communities of Egypt under medieval Islamic rule, while also studying the modern political and intellectual history of the Arab world. He regularly writes on Copts for the Huffington Post, and is writing now more broadly on Christians in the Middle East for Pathos in the Evangelical Portal. So without further ado, I'd like to ask Professor Mead to begin.
Great. Well, thank you.
Please join me in giving them a warm welcome.
Thanks. Nina probably knows much too much about my teaching methods. Her son, Tommy, was one of my students at Yale for some time and apparently did survive the experience. He's now in the Marine Corps, and he says that's actually much easier, which is something I think some of my Bard students would agree with too. What I thought I might do this morning is just sort of throw a couple of ideas up for you to think about. Process like the Arab Spring. I don't know, the Arab Spring is becoming a little anomalous as a name now that we're going to the first anniversary of the Arab Spring. You know, Arab Rising, I don't know what we're going to call it. But in any case, this complicated process that's taking place in a lot of different countries, under a lot of different conditions, where you can argue that in some places there's a lot of similarity between two different cases, and others not very much. All kinds of dimensions, some of them quite positive and exciting, some of them much more troubling. All of these things are taking place. So what can we say that's intelligent about them? How can we think in an interesting way about these. As I try to do that myself, I start by dividing my thoughts into two categories. One is ways in which these revolutions remind me of other revolutions that have taken place at other places and in other times. And then what do I see as being different or unique about this particular set? And I thought I'd give you today a couple of examples from under both categories, more as a way of sparking a discussion than trying to give some kind of an exhaustive account of a process that's still very much underway. There are a couple of important ways in which these revolutions remind us of earlier revolutionary processes, whether in Europe or North America or in other parts of the world. And people like to talk, people study revolution, they look at the history, the timing patterns that recur. In some ways, what we're seeing here is familiar. One of them, I think, is that in revolutionary processes, you often have sort of two independent drivers of the process. One is the breakdown of an existing order of society, of governance, and the other is the emergence of new forces that don't fit. So that you can have on the one hand, you can have a governing elite that's becoming ever more corrupt and out of touch and ineffective in some ways, when others is losing its capacity to rule, the conviction, whatever it takes that enables that government to hold on. But on the other, you can have a society which is becoming so much more complicated that the old institutions and structures don't account for it. There are new interests rising in the land that are not represented well in existing institutions, and they start having weight and power, and they demand to be heard. I think in general, in much of the Arab world, we tend to be seeing today more a decline of existing institutions and orders. These are more revolutions of collapse than revolutions of renewal, although there are elements of renewal in them. But we see the Egyptian regime had become, over decades, progressively, I think, more ossified, more corrupt, was unable to solve basic needs. You could go to Cairo year after year and not see a lot getting better, the same old problems sort of festering, while the population grew. So that I think while there were elements, we all saw the tweeters on Tahrir Square, and so there's sort of elements of people who represented a different consciousness in Egypt and a new kind of modernity or other things. In the end, it was that the old system was falling apart, seems to have been the decisive factor. Another way in which these revolutions, I think, are like waves of revolutions that we've seen in the past is that we have to understand them as a process. They're not, a revolution does not take you, normally speaking, to a Fukuyaman end of history. Liberal democratic capitalism. Revolution tends to be, now that we've introduced Fukuyama, we might as well be more Hegelian and say a moment in a process of historical change. So that the revolution isn't the end, it's a stage. Look, the French Revolution starts in 1789, and arguably it's not until after 1968 that France has finally settled into a mold. But in the meantime, it's had five republics, 2 monarchies, 3 monarchies, and 2 empires. We often, in the Anglo-Saxon world, so to speak, one often contrasts our own smooth revolutions, but in fact, the British Glorious Revolution is a moment in a process that included a rather brutal civil war. These revolutions are moments, they're not the solutions. I think this is very much the case in the Arab world today. These are not going to usher in a utopia. We saw in the original French Revolution, it actually ushered in a period of terror and of military adventurism. Hopefully we won't see this in the Arab world, but we are probably not going to see 6 months or even 2 years from now a family of peaceful, liberal, democratic Arab societies living happily together in greater and greater prosperity. So I am not pleased with that forecast, but that seems to be the case. Then there's another sort of link between these revolutions and the revolutions of Europe, and that is that they have a kind of a, they're not only about politics, they're sort of about identity. In Europe in the 19th century, liberal revolutions and nationalist revolutions were often, though not always, linked, so that the liberal program for self-determination generally meant all of us Czech speakers, who are the majority here in Czechia, should be able to go out and freely vote for a government which, under majority rule, is going to give Czechs a better deal than other people. And government jobs will go to people who speak Czech rather than speak German. And the state will employ college instructors and high school instructors who speak Czech rather than German. But this, because it was linked with a concept of democratic governance and self-determination, the nationalist cause in the 19th century was often fused in the minds of observers with the liberal cause. But in fact, there were these two elements. Yes, an element of liberal politics, but also of identity politics. And we saw in the 19th and 20th century in Europe, and also, for that matter, in the Middle East, these revolutionary processes whilst often spouting liberal slogans at one point, become the grounds for ethnic cleansings, for slaughters, for the homogenization of the development of homogeneous European nation states that are relatively homogeneous in terms of ethnicity, language, culture, religion, on the territory of what had before been very diverse multinational empires. So that in 1850 there were something like 4 or 5 states east of the Rhine. The Russian Empire, Ottoman Empire, Austrian Empire, German Empire, and then by 1950 dozens of states occupying that after 100 million people or so were killed. Islamism, to some degree, in some of these revolutions today, represents the kind of identity wing of a revolutionary movement. It's giving people like us more control. You can see it, I think, in Syria, where the conflict for self-determination also looks like a bit of a conflict between the Sunni and certain religious minorities in Syria. We certainly saw that in Iraq, the Sunni-Shia struggle and the consequences for Christians and other minorities has been and remains very high. So we may well see out of these revolutions a kind of a push toward homogenization, toward repression. We may see large groups of refugees and other things. None of that would be welcome, but none of it could be surprising to a student of past revolutions in world history. And I'll finally say something very brief about at least one way in which I think these revolutions are a little different from what we have looked at before, and that is the role of the fact that they are taking place in the Islamic world, among people whose culture, for the majority, is Islamic. There are many similarities between Islam and the other monotheistic religions. There are also some important differences. One of the, to me, most interesting differences politically has to do with the relationship of religion and state. And I'm not going to speak doctrinally here. I'm not really qualified to do that. But I want to think historically, if we think about how state and governance have historically worked in a lot of the Islamic world, at least in pre-modern terms, you tended to have a sort of a supreme ruler, the Sultan Caliph up there in Istanbul, who in theory is the absolute ruler. but the bureaucracy is rather weak. Once you get sort of 6 blocks away from the Sultan, it's not clear that what the Sultan says will happen. And in fact, what happens in most of the cities in these great empires is that the sort of local notables and the clergy run under Sharia, under traditional Islamic law, the affairs of the people. So there's sort of the affairs of state, the Sultan who maintains the boundaries and sets the overall framework. Often sultans don't seem to be bound by Islamic law personally. That is, they sort of kill people without a lot of trials. They seem in some cases to have more women than it looks to me, at least superficially, the Prophet allowed. There are other, so the Sultan in one sense he's a good Sultan if he permits the locals to run their affairs in the traditional Islamic way and defends the boundaries of the region as a whole. But the Sultan and the Sultan's governance are not really a part of, and are not digested by the same laws and so on. Now, obviously in the West we have had the idea of the sovereign and the question of what are the moral limits over the sovereign. But I think in the Islamic states, empires, the state was so divided, the gap between the absolute grand imperial state and then the tight organization of the local city was greater. In the 20th century, as that state became so much more important, what we see in many of the secular Arab countries is that the Sultan, now the secular president or what have you, tries to replace the traditional clerical and local notable authorities with bureaucratic people following more or less legal norms, in some cases less than others, but modern professionalized bureaucracy imposing a kind of a French Jacobin state on these traditional communities. A lot of what we're looking at now is, in a sense, a public rejection of this professionalized, laicized state, which in fact was corrupt and not very effective. I don't know that in the Islamic context there's a lot of thought about what comes next. Again, this would probably link back to my original idea that what we're seeing now looks more like a revolution fundamentally driven by failure than a revolution that is fundamentally driven by growth. So those are some thoughts that I hope will be interesting.
Thank you. Sam.
Thank you. 1 year ago, the events of the Arab Spring took place, and perhaps 1 year after those events, it's as good a time as any to reflect on them and view what our early assessments were and how they have stood the test of reality after 1 year. While it's important to note that the events are still taking place, many of the stories in Syria and Yemen are still going on in their bloody terms, the transitions in the other countries are still a process in the making. Perhaps today it's worth our time to look at 4 different images that we have come with at the beginning of those revolutions, uprisings, specifically in Egypt, and see how they have developed throughout this year. The first image we had was that of Christians and Muslims praying together in Tahrir Square in Egypt. 1 year after that, we have an image of an increase of violence against Christians in terms both of direct attacks and a general culture of harassment to them. We have an increasing number of Christian immigration from Egypt, and the plight of Egypt's Christians is becoming a question that foreign policy administrations are grappling with, are trying to deal with. The second image is that of the liberal, tech-savvy youth that supposedly started this revolution and that were an assurance to everyone that there was no need to worry. The old regimes were breaking. We were finally coming out of the eternal Faustian choice between Islamism and authoritarianism. And there were those people, the Google executive, those young men, that would usher a new era into Egypt and hopefully the region. 1 year after, it's quite hard for anyone to pinpoint where those youth have went. Where is Wa'il Ghunim? Where is Mohammed al-Baradei, who was highlighted on CNN as representing the Egyptian uprising? Well, he's polling 2% of the Egyptian population at the moment in presidential elections. The third image is that of Israel. The media initially told us that Israel was not part of those uprisings. This was not about the Arab-Israeli conflict. Less than a year after that, we got an attack on the Israeli embassy that thankfully didn't leave anyone hurt. The last moment, it was the American defense minister's intervention that saved those 6 guards in the Israeli embassy. The last image that we had is of Islamism. Initially, the general assessment was that the Islamists were not part of the story of the Arab Spring. Either they were a scarecrow that Mubarak and other dictators had been using, or they were now suffering from breaks into their ranks. Their youth would break from them. They were not the people behind the Arab Spring. They were not a majority. President Obama told us they were a faction, not a majority of the Egyptian population. 1 year after, of course, we get the Egyptian elections. And we see the Islamists, not only is the Muslim Brotherhood now at 48% of the seats in the Egyptian parliament, but we get the more hardline Salafists who apparently no one in the foreign policy establishment knew they even existed in the first place, at a quarter of the seats. Those changing images perhaps question what our early mistakes were in analyzing what was going on during the Arab Spring. First, perhaps, was the lesson of Burke has somehow failed to make its impact on our minds. That yes, to form a government is an easy task. You need to settle the capital, teach people obedience. That giving people freedom is also an easy task. But to form a free government is not an easy task. The second problem, the second mistake we probably did, is the equation of freedom, a value that we believe in, with democracy, and then with revolutions. Perhaps it's the fact that the last great revolutions that we witnessed had all ushered some form of path towards freedom in Eastern Europe. Perhaps this made us forget the lessons of revolutions before that, and that revolutions do not necessarily usher a new era of freedom. The most important, however, lesson that we somehow missed or led to our not realizing the real story behind the Arab Spring is that question of Islamism, of underestimating the influence of the Islamists and how they would shape the Arab Spring. Now, as the lesson is starting to get understood in Washington, it seems that we are starting with other myths and other misconceptions about the Islamists. The first is that the Islamists will moderate. Whether it's Thomas Friedman in the New York Times or other foreign policy experts are arguing that the Islamists, forced to govern, will moderate. The fact of the matter is that the Islamists will take definitely an important role, if not the only role, in shaping the next Egyptian government, but it will in no sense be a moderate one. The reason behind this is not that the leadership would not want to take that stand. The main problem facing the Muslim Brotherhood leadership at the moment is not those individual liberal parties that have won 8% here and 2% there. It's the challenge from the Salafists. And being the pragmatic leadership that they are forced to deal with that challenge towards their base. Not only are the Salafists at 25% of the vote, they also reflect the base of the Muslim Brotherhood. Simply speaking, lacking any coherent thinker inside the Muslim Brotherhood after Hassan al-Banna, with the exception of Sayyid Qutb, in a worse direction, the Brotherhood indoctrination process, the kind of books that people inside the movement read, the rank and file, those people have been indoctrinated in Salafist literature for the past 30 years. So any attempt by the leadership to moderate, to appeal to the West, to try to project a better image of themselves, means simply that they will be losing their base to a challenge from those Salafis. Here it's important to notice that the Brotherhood leadership has not actually moderated in its doctrines. Yes, they will give the Western journalist a good answer to a question about Israel or about what their views in Egypt, but the difference between pragmatism and moderation is important to note here. There has been no ideological shift inside the movement. There has been an appeasement or an appeal to the West, partly due to the weakness in front of state repression, and partly due to the urge to appeal to the West and remove the kind of obstacles that they see as barring their reaching power. The second argument that is now in Washington is that even if they don't moderate, the Islamists will fail. We need not worry about them for too long, because faced with the enormous economic challenges that Egypt is facing at the moment, they will automatically fail. And the next elections, people will vote for other parties. The basic assumptions of that argument might be correct in the fact that the Egyptian economy is in a horrible state. But the problem is that economic failure does not necessarily mean electoral defeat. We've seen different totalitarian movements in the past not succeeding economically, but maintaining their control of the country. We've in fact not seen totalitarian movements lose power due to the simple refusal of the people to continue supporting that regime or to free elections taking place. We also don't realize that a movement like the Muslim Brotherhood, which had suffered from state repression for 30-something years under Mubarak, has been able to build a social base of support based on services that they provide with very limited resources and with the state repression. What will they be capable of doing now that they will be the state themselves? Yes, the whole economy might not succeed, but that doesn't mean that they won't be able to create a patron-client relationship and continue winning. The third aspect of this is the fact of free elections themselves. There's no guarantee that free elections will be held in the future in Egypt. The elections might be held, but so does Iran hold elections. That's meaningless in terms of whether people are able to change their government or not. More importantly, however, from those two ideas is the underlying assumption behind them, and that is that we are dealing with a movement that is similar to any other political party. That Islamism will act as any other political party and will fail as such. Islamism is not a political movement that is similar to liberalism or to authoritarian rulers in the past. Islamism is a totalitarian ideology that operates not in terms of only trying to control the state, but also to transform society. Islamists will not operate according to the rules of the game. They will set the very rules of the game in the future. So the idea that we can somehow hope that the situation will get better soon and that we don't need to take the challenge seriously is a problematic idea. The last, perhaps, image that we have in Washington, or new assumption that we have here, is that the institutions in Egypt will constrain the Islamist power, be it the Egyptian army or the Egyptian police. The army is neither the secular army of Turkey, nor has the Turkish army succeeded in constraining the Islamist government there. But the assumption that we can have in Egypt some form of a Turkish model is simply fantasy. The Egyptian army is neither secular nor is it professional. It's an army made up of conscripts, and in 5 years it will be as an Islamist army as any other segment of the Egyptian society. The idea that we can hope that the police apparatus can be outside of the Islamist control, well, they've thought of that as well, and suggesting to create citizens' committee to protect the different Egyptian neighborhoods, they're basically saying we can form a militia apparatus outside of government to protect us from any form of constraint that an army or a police can have on us. The ability of the civilian government, while we still don't know what will be exactly in the Egyptian constitution, the ability of the civilian government to decide on army promotions, to interfere with the vast economic empire that the Egyptian armed forces has, will mean more control and Islamizing that institution. What we are witnessing in the region is a very important event, not in terms of the uprising of people rejecting tyranny or rejecting an authoritarian regime after years of suffering for them, but in two other aspects. The first, Professor Meade talked about the collapse of the state apparatus in the region, the rejection of the Arab nationalist secular state that has dominated the region for so long. And the second is the rise of Islamism. As a discourse and as an idea, Islamism has been formed and transformed by defeat and failure throughout its history, whether it was Afghani and Abdu, whether it was Rida, whether it was Hassan al-Banna or Sayyid Qutb. The stories of their defeat and the repression that they were under and failures have transformed the ideology of the movement. For the first time in its history, today Islamism is victorious in a significant place. This is not Gaza, this is not Sudan. We are seeing now a wipe of the whole region, of Tunisia, of Libya in the future, and most importantly of Egypt. How this will transform Islamism as an ideology is a question that will continue to be an important one for us 20, 30 years from now. Whether the caliphate issue re-emerges as an important ideological question for Sunni Islam or not. How the movement will deal with the greater divisions inside of it. In a sense, a spectrum, if to quote Marx, is haunting not only Europe but the world. And that spectrum is one that we will have to deal with in the future. I would last say that this is not, in any sense, I hope this is not understood as an inevitable outcome or a gloomy picture. I'm not saying that Islamism cannot be defeated. It can be indeed, and it will. But to defeat Islamism, one has to take it seriously at first. One has to realize that we are witnessing the growth of a movement that is dependent on a moral structure, a coherent ideology that we might consider shallow, but that offers its followers a clear worldview, a moral structure that has no alternative in the region. And to defeat something, to defeat an existing structure, you better start offering something else. You cannot defeat something with nothing. Thank you.
Excuse me. I'm going to be looking at a very specific set of issues. We're sort of moving down the table from the broad down to the specific, and I'm going to be looking in particular at the question of how religious minorities are faring in the region. And let me begin by saying that as the complexities and challenges of these regional uprisings that we collectively discuss as the Arab Spring have really overshadowed the initial excitement, or sorry to use the overused term, but the initial euphoria about that Arab Spring. What we are beginning to see, even in just the last few weeks, has been a slow shift of media discourse toward what we might talk about as long-term considerations. In other words, okay, maybe our initial excitement was a little bit too quick. Maybe we're not looking at immediate transformation overnight. But rather, we're starting to see analysts and journalists and others say, well, this is a struggle that may take a generation to work out, maybe 20 to 30 years. Or if we use the French case, as Professor Meade has suggested, perhaps 200 years. And as Sam mentioned, perhaps when we look at groups like, different Islamist organizations, over time, over that period of time, over a medium period of time, they will moderate. They'll become just like, other groups. This may be all well and good. And perhaps, as many would like to imagine, Egypt and Syria, the two places that I'll be particularly looking at today, will be shining beacons of liberal democracy, religious freedom, economic success in 25 years. But the reality is, of the moment, that religious minorities in Egypt and Syria simply don't have 20 to 30 years to wait for the world's attention. In Egypt, within the coming decade, and likely much sooner, they will face more challenges than the considerable challenges they've already faced in recent years from, as an Islamist-dominated and popularly elected government. In Syria, there's perhaps an even more immediate crisis. And in fact, few people in media circles seem to be asking what will follow the fall of the Assad regime, whether that is possible, inevitable, or perhaps planned, depending on which statements you like to read about what's going on in Syria. Nevertheless, it is clear that the country's religious minorities, which are considerable, including a variety of Christian sects, which I will be looking at today, the Alawite sect itself, which of course is closely identified with the Assad regime, but to which not all Alawites actually belong, it should be pointed out, and a host of other religious and ethnic minorities are at a very real risk of becoming victims of retaliation and a cycle of violence should the regime fall, or the country simply fully collapse into sectarian civil war. In both cases, as I mentioned, I'll be looking at the Christian minorities. A large part of that is I'm simply speaking to the things that I know better than other issues. But also these minorities are representative of other groups as well. It would be just as easy to speak of the Baha'is in Egypt, for example. So let me turn to Egypt. Of course, Egypt's religious minorities, including Coptic Christians, the majority of which are Coptic Orthodox, but joined as well by Catholic and Protestant communities as well, joined by perhaps a few thousand Baha'is. And as we've discussed at length here at the Center for Religious Freedom, both in writing and in our previous event back in October, there have been dozens of acts of violence against the Coptic Christian minority throughout 2011, most of which followed the revolution, many of which were instigated by Salafi imams who incited riots in places like Mbaba in May, El Merinab, of course, in September, and in the village of Sol earlier in the year. This isn't just a matter of mob riots or mob attacks. There have also been individual cases as well, such as the case of the Upper Egyptian teacher goading on the teenagers in his classroom to beat their classmate, Ayman Labib, to death in October, initially for his wearing a cross. These sorts of incidences, of course, have happened after the revolution. We've talked about it here, we've covered it, but I do want to reiterate that these things have gone on. And equally dangerous has been a continuation from the Mubarak regime of the culture of legal impunity for these sorts of religiously motivated attacks and this sort of violence. Very, very few of the people, if any at all, who instigated this violence, who incited people to carry out acts of violence or inspired them or actually directly carried them out, have been held accountable by any definition of the term. And that by the end of the year, of course, or by this fall, it was the ruling military junta itself in the well-covered, sadly, Maspero attacks, in which the military itself was found to be shooting at mostly Coptic protesters, running them over with armored vehicles, and to make matters even worse, creating a rather elaborate series of conspiracy theories and other outright fabrications to do everything they could to relinquish any sort of responsibility for that. Meanwhile, of course, as Samuel has just spent some time discussing, the now confirmed dominance of the Muslim Brotherhood, particularly in its Freedom and Justice Party, and the disconcerting second-place showing for the unquestionably intolerant Salafi groups, chief among them the Noor Party, has religious minorities in Egypt deeply unsettled as to what the future holds for them. The Freedom and Justice Party has made some positive actions even in the last few weeks. They did make sure to be very public about sending some of their youth out to protect churches on Christmas and New Year's, to make sure to accept Pope Shenouda's invitation to attend a Christmas Mass, or at least to send a delegation to do so. But these individual actions, as nice as they may be, still do not change the core message, the core vision of the Muslim Brotherhood, and by extension, the Freedom and Justice Party. The Muslim Brotherhood is nothing if not patient. It is promising eventual change in the country. Whether that means in a matter of months or in a matter of years is still up in the air. But it is clear what sort of a country the Muslim Brotherhood would like to have in 5, 10, or 20 years. And I'll leave the details of that to the side for now. At the end of the day, Copts and other religious minorities in Egypt, they don't need protectors. They don't need special treatment. They need equal and individual citizenship above and beyond anything else. And it is impossible for this to happen within an ideology that places the communal and religious identity of Egypt narrowly defined as Islamic at the front and center. And in fact, it is this battle of ideas of equal citizenship and all the rights and protections that flow from that needs to be waged clearly, unapologetically, unflinchingly, and unceasingly in the months and years to come. And we should particularly keep that in mind in 2012 as the constitutional battle in Egypt heats up. Turning to Syria, Syria, of course, is a very different ballgame from Egypt. And one of the good directions that we see the media and the foreign policy community turning towards in the last few months is beginning to leave aside the paradigm of talking about the Arab Spring as one monolithic movement, but rather beginning to really look at these localized movements. And that's certainly the case with Syria. It shouldn't be lumped in together with Egypt or other countries and under this broad umbrella, neither in terms of the nature of the uprising, the severity of the regime's response, or the challenges facing the religious minorities. And to a certain extent, it does need to be made clear that Syria's religious minorities share in the same foreboding crisis that faces the whole country: confusion, uncertainty, fear of a society that, by many people's estimates, may be sliding into a civil war if it's not already there. And certainly an increase in activity by the Free Syrian Army, what seemed to be some pretty brutal tactics by the regime in suppressing things, all seem to point to the thought that that scenario is becoming very close indeed. But religious minorities do face a particular crisis in this regard, and in discussing their issue, I'm neither giving a defense here of the Assad regime and the way that it's dealt with this, nor am I making an effort to undermine the very real mortal struggle that many Syrians are undertaking, even as we speak today. It's not for me to discredit or judge these activities. It's Syrians who are responsible for themselves. But regardless of this, it is important to point out the potential consequences, whether intended or unintended, of nearly a year of this uprising. And in this case, Syria's Christian minorities are really caught between a proverbial rock and a hard place. They have been shielded by the regime for decades in exchange for their tacit support. Much has been written about this. This is not a tremendous secret. I should say that this is more than just kind of a broad general protection, but it is a real sense of genuine and surprising degree of religious freedom, not political freedom. I certainly wouldn't want to go and suggest that at all. Anecdotally, the first time I visited Syria was in 1997, happened to be in the city of Aleppo for Easter of that year, and I was shocked, particularly having come from Egypt, where Copts are very often seen but very rarely heard. I was shocked to hear church bells ringing and to actually hear the Easter Mass being played out to an overflowing congregation in the street. This is not to decry the wonderful, glorious religious freedoms under the Assad regime, but just to say it is clear that Christian minorities, along with others, were given some very real advantages by the Assad regime. And as the uprising has progressed, and Syrians themselves throughout the country are divided as to their political allegiances, these Christian communities find themselves really caught in the middle. On one side, you have a regime to which it has genuinely owed decades of peace, albeit at a price of political freedom, along with the rest of the country. A regime that is threatening that its fall will mean an inevitable victory of Islamic extremists. And keep in mind, of course, that Syria remains to this day a relatively sheltered society, and it's hard to blame many of these Christian communities for believing what the Assad regime has to say in this regard, as do many other supporters of the regime. And of course, there is the real threat, as I mentioned earlier, which is one facing all of Syria, that in fact a descent into sectarian civil war could very well mean retaliatory violence against any of the sects, Christian, Alawite, or otherwise, that are perceived as loyal to the Assad regime. Furthermore, a future governing power in Syria really is an unknown, just as the simple verification of material coming out of the country is very often an unknown quantity. The closest we've come to a future governing power is perhaps the Syrian National Council, whose legitimacy is yet to be firmly established. It has, to its credit, declared support for a civil state that does not distinguish between religious communities. But on the other hand, its membership includes exactly one member of the Christian minority, which by most statistics makes up around 10% of the population. And that one member is of an Assyrian background. But on the other hand, the membership contains a number of professed members of the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood, and quite a few of them are simply declared unaffiliated, or I should say undeclared, to conceal their identities. And these question marks that even the Syrian National Council, to the extent that it does represent the uprising in Syria, does raise concern for many Syrian Christians. At the same time, what would a short-term withdrawal of support for the regime from the Christian communities mean? Well, we've seen horrifying footage of the Syrian army's brutality toward protesters and those who harbor them in cities across the country, and it is perfectly reasonable for us to expect, and for the religious minorities in Syria to expect, that the regime will not hesitate to treat with equal hostility anyone that declares it is throwing in with the opposition. So it's not hard then to understand the reticence of the Syrian Christian minority to declare a side in this conflict. The Maronite Catholic Bishop Rai, who is responsible for a sizable Maronite community in Syria, and has a pretty good sense of the pulse of that group, drew very sharp criticism in September 2011 when he discussed a hypothetical scenario, and he was fairly careful to lay out that it was a hypothetical scenario in which Bashar al-Assad remained in power. And just this week, the Greek Orthodox Archbishop Luca El-Khoury in Syria complained about EU-US sanctions against Syria, saying, "Those who are imposing sanctions on the Syrian people and threatening their daily bread know nothing about the meaning of democracy, neither human rights nor human values." Speaking at an interfaith service for the people killed in an apparent suicide bombing against the regime last week. We can read in this a real fear of the consequences more than the substance or the ideas behind this protracted uprising in Syria. Again, without discrediting the content of the uprising or disrespecting the sacrifices that many people have made to that opposition, and without ascribing any undue legitimacy to the brutal Assad regime, we must face the harsh reality that a real threat hangs over the nation's religious minorities and the global community must be more prepared than it has been so far to intentionally and explicitly deal with this prospect. Thank you.
Well, I'd like to thank all of our panelists for providing a very rich and thought-provoking discussion. And I think the only thing that I would disagree with what's been said so far is Sam's assessment that this is not a gloomy picture. I will not use my prerogative as chair to ask the first question instead, in the interest of time, because we have promised to get you out by 1:30, to let you ask, immediately start with the questions. I only ask that you identify yourself and wait for the microphone. Okay, let's start in the first row here. This is being streamed on our website, as well as I think VOA is.
I'm Michael Kurtzig. My question is, how much power does the $3 billion a year of U.S. aid have to influence what goes on in Egypt? Is anything at all?
I assume the question is...
Yeah, why don't you start?
I think it has, the impact is primarily with the military, which needs the aid. I think we really look at there are forces in Egypt that need a strong economic connection to the outside world, including aid, both from the U.S. and from others. They would include the military, which gets direct assistance. Roughly 10% of Egypt's GDP comes from tourism, and we look at foreign investment. So I think there's some even an Islamist government in Egypt does need to think long and hard about breaking those ties, and my guess is they won't be quick to do it.
Pam, did you want to add something?
I think it's the military that cares about it, not only in terms of financing, but also more importantly in terms of the weapons themselves. The Egyptian military is nearly 85% supplied by the US, and a threat in the relationship between the US and Egypt will not only mean financial resources not being available, which they can get from somewhere else, but more importantly, spare parts for their weapons and kind of things the militaries want.
To add to that as well, it's a rather confusing game that's going on in terms of U.S. military assistance to Egypt, of course. It's very clear that in the short term, the Egyptian military believes that to be untouchable. And certainly their crackdown on NGOs in Egypt a couple of weeks ago demonstrates that they don't think that there's anything that they could do that would mess with that money flowing into them fairly freely. And so far, even though there's been, of course, discussion within the administration about putting some conditions on that aid, it's still going, and it's still in the works to go. At the same time, looking in sort of medium range, as the Muslim Brotherhood has been looking forward to coming into a position of dominance in the government in the future, there's been a lot of discussion lately about the Camp David Accords, the future of that. It's perhaps unofficial, but clear link with U.S. military assistance to Egypt. One of the things that the Freedom and Justice Party, by extension the Muslim Brotherhood, does well is to sell itself as a very populist organization. And while in one hand they've not been quite so explicit as to say when we come into power we're going to abrogate that treaty, because that would guarantee that money, or virtually guarantee that money would disappear. They're trying to say, well, look, it's not up to us, it's up to the people. I imagine we're going to see at some point that if it's put to a popular referendum, as they say they want to do, hard to say whether it will come to that, it will be sold as having been a popularly decided thing. And therefore, there's no reason the U.S. should withdraw that military support. I don't think they're going to be in a rush to have that done, but they're going to do everything they can do to have their policies put in place and still hold on to that money.
Continue.
Daniel Moro, Johns Hopkins, sorry. The question is for Dr. Tadros. How can you assess, if it's possible, the relation between the Salafist and the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt?
Salafism as a word means to your ancestors, or the people that lived before, i.e. the first generation of Muslims that were at the time of the Prophet. In a sense, the Muslim Brotherhood has always been a Salafi organization. Hassan al-Banna has talked about explicitly about and used the term Salafi. He has sprung from the discourse of people like Rashid Rida, the student of Muhammad Abdu. So the Salafi discourse has always been there. Of course, Salafism itself has developed in its later years. From while the organizations Ansar al-Sunnah al-Muhammadiyya and the Jama'iyya Shar'iyya have always been there since, one from 1908, the other from 1926, the Wahhabi influence in the 70s has further transformed the ideas of the Salafis. And how this has developed in their discourses has affected also the Muslim Brotherhood discourse at the time. So the more important link today is with the more modern version of Salafism and not the earlier one that has always been there. The Salafis operate basically, there is no central organization. The Noor Party is irrelevant to the discussion. The real idea behind the Salafis are those various sheikhs that live in the various places in the countryside. And you see a clear reflection of those sheikhs in the size of support that the Salafis would get. So governorate like Munafiyah in the middle of the Egyptian Delta, it's rural, it's a perfect target for Salafis. But because there is no Salafi sheikh there, they don't perform well. While in other governorates next to it, where there is a sheikh, you would see them getting 30% of the vote in those places. So it's a very disorganized movement until this moment. And important also to note that the two most important Salafi sheikhs in Egypt and arguably in the whole world have thus far refrained from commenting on political issues. Both Muhammad Ismail al-Muqaddim of Alexandria and the authority of Salafism in the world, Abu Ishaq al-Huwaini, have not been very supportive of the move towards politics. What would happen if those two get involved? No one would want to know, basically.
Okay. There is a question.
Hi, my name is Fatima Balasrar. I'm with the Embassy of Yemen. I'd like to thank the Hudson Institute and you, Nina, for bringing an excellent panel. It has been a very rich discussion. The what we understand is that the Muslims are going to continue to rise. There is a desire for the Muslims to dominate the scene. I think that was one of the elements of change. They want to do things their way. So they're not going to go in anytime soon. I can't see the Copts taking over because it's just a matter of math. You are a minority in Egypt. So my question is, what are your recommendations for coexisting of both? That was the first question. And the second is, in terms of foreign policy, how would you advise the U.S. administration in dealing with the Muslims? Islam is very much a religion of governance, and it will continue to influence the day-to-day affairs of politics and social life. So how would you advise the U.S. administration in dealing with the Muslims, because they will be there? Thanks.
Professor, why don't you start?
Okay, well, again, I think obviously there's a very long history of coexistence between Copts and Muslims in Egypt. And in that sense, it would be presumptuous of any outsider to make a suggestion, something that has been going on for 1,300 years. But I think we do have to understand that in the last 150 years, there has been a decline of toleration of diversity in many different societies, as I said earlier, including many European societies. And sort of religious or ethnic diversity that was once seen as acceptable is seen as unacceptable as the modernization process goes forward. This has to do a lot, I think, with the transformation of a state. That is, a traditional pre-modern state has almost no local employees when you think about it. But if you decide now that every child in a city must have 12 years of education paid for by the state, there's going to be a very large cadre of people who get jobs. What language will they speak? What religion will they profess? How are they hired? Who controls that? Suddenly the state and its religious and ethnic preferences become a much bigger issue. And I think particularly in the Syrian case, you know, we could well see a period of prolonged ethnic struggle. Lebanon is in many ways not all that different from Syria, and historically was part of it. I think that's part of what worries us. The situation of the Copts in Egypt is, in a sense, unique. The Copts are the only large Christian minority that survived the 20th century in a predominantly Muslim country without enormous trouble. Will they survive the 21st? It's a legitimate question, and I don't think anybody knows the answer. The real problem in some ways, if we think about Egypt, is I don't think anybody can fix the Egyptian economy anytime soon. And the countries that might provide additional aid are all feeling very tapped out. And the IMF may be more worried about preventing a breakdown of the European economy than about shoring up Egypt. And by the way, even in Egypt's interest, that might be more important, because where do those tourists come from who go to Egypt, who buys Egypt's goods? And a collapse in Europe would be calamitous for the entire Mediterranean area. So what we're going to have, I think, is a government that can't give the people what they thought they were voting for, which is a better day-to-day life. And then the question becomes, well, why can't you give us a better day-to-day life? And then it's quite convenient and tempting to say, because of these awful people who are preventing it, or who are taking more than their share. And Egyptian history in the 20th century did see waves of dispossession of people who were suddenly perceived as intolerable foreigners. The very large Greek and other minorities that used to live in cities like Alexandria and Cairo are not there anymore. So, I don't know what advice to give in this situation, but I think the rest of the world may well be tested by what kind of response. It's clearly better for everyone, for Copts and Muslims in Egypt, for the two groups to continue with a productive association and live together as they have for more than 1,000 years. That would be the best course. Friends of Egypt, whether they're friends of Egypt's Muslims or friends of Egypt's Christians or friends of all Egyptians, should be trying to bring that about. I don't know whether we can succeed, but I certainly hope we can.
Yeah. First, I'd like to differentiate between Muslims and Islamism. The difference, of course, being obvious. Egypt will be ruled most probably, definitely by Muslims. But the question is not Muslims and whether Christians will rule or not, but Islamism as a political discourse. I think the important thing for Washington and for those interested in what's going on in the region, the important lesson or the important thing to note is that this is not a beauty contest. There are no nice people that we are backing in a fight against the bad people. This is the least ugly contest. We are choosing between bad options. There are no good options in the region. Neither a return to an authoritarian regime, or a collapse of Somalia on the Nile, nor a totalitarian project in the region is a nice outcome. So we're dealing with a situation that there are a number of bad choices, and our goal is to stop the worst of these. My sense would be the worst two options at the moment would be a complete collapse, Somalia on the Nile, with the second being a totalitarian experiment, the Islamist majority in parliament being transformed into a real totalitarian project in the country. to stop both of these, I think it's necessary to keep a sense of balance in Egypt, meaning that no particular group is able to control the whole government or society. The military should be there as a balance to the Islamists, not in terms of stopping their project, it won't happen as I explained, but in terms of leaving a certain sphere outside of their direct control. This idea of keeping balance between the different powers, not supporting the military too much so they wouldn't go to an Algerian scenario and we'd get a civil war, and not destroying the institution too much and allowing the Islamists to control it. So that would be my advice.
One final and very brief addition. There continues to be a fair amount of discussion about the question of engagement with the Muslim Brotherhood. And of course, engagement is a pretty broad term. It can mean a lot of different things. In one sense, there is no question that the U.S., present and future administrations will have to engage with them. We know now that certainly the lower house of parliament, the bigger and more important one in Egypt, is going to be dominated by the Freedom and Justice Party. And so we will have to engage with them to the extent that we engage with the Egyptian government, which there's no sign of that relationship discontinuing anytime soon. I think what needs to happen is a real closer examination, a real closer familiarity with the ideology, a close reading of the political programs which are out there for everyone to read. I mean, none of the things that the Freedom and Justice Party or others espouse are secrets. As do all politicians when they talk to different audiences, they emphasize different things, but at the end of the day, their programs are out there to read. Most of them are even very nicely translated for non-Arabic speakers. And so it's not a secret, the sorts of things that they want to see happen. Many of those things, implicitly or explicitly, are things that the U.S. would be uncomfortable with to see happen with our allies for a variety of reasons. And I think the important thing is that the U.S. government needs to be better informed to say, okay, when we sit down and we do engage with the Muslim Brotherhood's political wing and its alliances and however those sorts of things work out, we're not going to go in there and ask them, so what are you about? We're going to say, we know what you're about. We know you. We've read all of your stuff. We've examined you closely. We know how you started. We know how you've gotten here. And we're here to say, we still have a relationship. We're still talking with you. But if you want to maintain a relationship with us economically, strategically, diplomatically, and our allies, here are some things that we need to sit down and really have a hard talk about. I think that the question of engagement without an overdue sense of, or an undue sense of optimism, but rather a real cold, hard look, a very realistic look is what's really needed for that engagement.
And hopefully when we do sit down and talk, we're not just demanding the right to wear bikinis and drink alcohol, but actually demanding religious freedom and freedom of speech.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's go over this side. In the back there.
Thanks. Dan Robinson from Voice of America. As you know, President Obama faced considerable degree of criticism and second-guessing and third-guessing and fourth-guessing over the policy toward the Arab Spring as it developed. Can you, at this point, can you look back and just talk a little bit about what you think, whether you think the correct calculations were made? You got into some of that just now, I know. Correct calculations were made, and how that will impact U.S. foreign policy going forward into another second term or a Romney administration.
You're not asking about a Gingrich administration. Voice of America calls the Republican process. Look, I think one of the things I did when the Arab Spring launched is I went back and looked at other revolutionary processes in the world to see how American presidents had handled them. And what I've discovered is basically we've never gotten any of them right. Revolutions are too unpredictable. If what was happening was predictable, we wouldn't call it a revolution. It would be an evolutionary process. And in fact, in every revolution, American presidents have to face the sort of, well, on the one hand, we have an existing set of relationships with the government that's in power. We have economic interests. We have worked out way accommodating one another. In general, foreigners almost always don't like it when other countries change their government. Then there's the question of what to do about the Islamist tendencies in the revolution. Do you start from day one standing on the housetop and warning how much you hate everything that's happening and predicting an inevitable confrontation? Well, that, you know, it's one thing is clear about that course of action: it will lead to a confrontation, and it will alienate and deepen. There's so many things that are not clear, because the political revolutions inside certain countries are not the only thing that's changing in the Middle East. Turkey hasn't really had a revolution, but the change in Turkey's foreign policy and the way that is shifting realities in the region, how that is likely to play out, or the role of the Syrian revolution in terms of the ongoing U.S. problems with Iran. So the president can't just respond to the political leanings of this or that group inside a particular country. One is also trying to assess an incredibly complicated international field that reacts in unpredictable ways with the unpredictable changes in all of these countries. I think what any president would have to do, Republican, Democrat, or Libertarian for that matter, would be, you know, you've got to scramble. You've got to try to keep your eyes on America's long-term geopolitical interests in the region, the approaches of our allies in the region. You have to be listening to the Saudis, to others in the Gulf, to very many voices, and you're trying, again, the Muslim Brotherhood doesn't know how power will change it, where it will be in 4 to 5 years. So I think the idea that an American president of any party can sort of figure out from day one the deep master plan for dealing with revolutionary transformations in half a dozen strategically important countries, you know, when you put it that way, you realize he can't. And whoever's president is going to make a lot of guesses, and some of the guesses are going to be wrong. And all of us in the press and the think tank world are going, nee, 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 nee. Okay, it's, you know, it's just chatter. The reality is you have a situation that's changing, a president who's struggling to manage it. I wish him well. I wish his successors well. It's not going to be easy.
Gal in the middle there. Is a young lady in the middle.
My name is Kira Richards. My question is directed at Mr. Tadros. On your comment regarding the misconception that Islamists will moderate, I see that being the case in Egypt, but I was wondering what your opinion was about Ennahda and Tunisia, where it seems the Salafists do not have such a push.
Rashid Ghannouchi was here in town, and he made the rounds in the various think tanks. I had a chance to have lunch with him and discuss those issues. I think the Salafists in Tunisia have chosen to be outside of the political process. But in the last month or two, we've seen a number of Occupy universities by Salafists to stop to segregate the sexes in the universities with various demands of them. Some in Tunisia have linked this to people inside Ennahda, that not everyone in Ennahda has moderated as Ghannouchi has. There's also been the question of Ennahda's relationship to Hamas, with the visit of Ismail Haniyeh to Tunisia and the kind of slogans that were there, the apology later and so on. I think the relative strength of the Salafis in Tunisia is less. The society is different. It doesn't have the historical baggage that Egypt has. the level of education, of liberal gains and freedoms for women, for minorities, there is much more. So it would be a reversal of an existing order and not continuing in the same trend as in Egypt, which would make the challenge for any Islamist government there greater in the sense of changing the very fabrics of society. The size of the victory has also been very different. In Tunisia, 40%. In Egypt, we're speaking of 72, 73%. I would say that the situation there would probably be a much better picture than the Egyptian case.
We have, we'll take one more question. Just this young man right here.
Hi, my name's Garrett Nada. I'm a graduate student at GW studying Islamic and Middle East Studies. I have a question that goes back to the topic of whether or not minorities need protectionism or equal rights. And right now, when we're waiting for elections and we're waiting for constitutions to be written up, the other people that are sort of stuck in a hard place, I think, are Congress. Some of them have mailboxes that are being flooded with letters from Christian interest groups and others that are demanding something be done. And so what tools are really available other than offering these groups to come here as refugees, which we already have huge communities of expatriates, and I can't blame people for wanting to leave, but sort of what do we do in these 2 or 3 years that we might really be waiting to have even anybody to talk to try to influence? Thank you.
Yeah, this is a big question. I wanted to say earlier in the year, we are in 2012 now. Good morning. Last fall, there was a period where, over the matter of a couple of weeks, a report had come out in Egypt that there were 100,000 people, Christians, Coptic Christians, that had fled Egypt, and that there was going to be 250,000. That number seems to have sort of entered the consciousness. I still haven't yet seen very good verification in terms of methodology, in terms of actual details of those figures. And rather than look at the accuracy of those figures, I think it's more important to look at it as a trend. And anecdotally, there are a lot more Copts that are talking amongst themselves, sometimes quietly, sometimes loudly, saying, "Boy, I don't know how we can stay around here a whole lot longer." But we're talking about probably over 8 million people. We're not talking about a group of 10 or 20 or even 100,000 people. We're talking about millions of people. And so this isn't a matter where this massive group of people can or should just pick up and leave. The protection question is an interesting one. There's an ideological component to it, and this is where it comes back to what I mentioned in my talk about this, I hate to use the word war here, but the war of ideas that really needs to be waged. An important part of Islamist ideology regarding religious minorities is a matter of rights being bestowed on those communities. It's not a matter of, let's say the Freedom and Justice Party saying, all right, as soon as we get into power, we're just going to go out and slaughter all those Christians and anybody else that's left. That's not the case, and I think anyone who sort of overstates that is, well, overstating it. But instead, we are looking at an ideological question here, where if you look at the language of the Freedom and Justice Party's electoral program from 2011, they make references in very pleasant and very conciliatory language towards the Copts, and they say, look, they contribute to the moral fiber of society and all those sorts of things, and so we recognize them as being part of things. But it's really in a spirit of, look, we're the Muslim majority in the Islamic framework. I should say the Islamist framework of being a sort of total system, saying, yeah, we will allow Copts to be here in Egypt. We will bestow on them certain rights and freedoms to the extent that they are contributors to the greater moral fabric of society. But it's not an equal footing. It's not a matter of saying they are equal citizens in this shared thing that we call Egypt, and we are Egyptians before we are this or that. It's that question of identity politics coming back again. So there's an ideological question. I think there are small issues that could be addressed, things like questions of the national ID card in Egypt, where where one's name can be listed on the ID instead of their name and their religion. Those are kind of small things that represent this question of citizenship. And making my way slowly back around to your initial question, I think those ideas are the most important thing, whatever that may mean, whatever kind of initiative, whatever kind of NGO project, whatever kind of U.S. administration initiatives to do so, those ideas need to be made much more public, to become much more part of the discourse in places like Egypt. Sam made a very good point about one of the main differences between the Tunisian model and the Egyptian model is the way that the public kind of views these different movements and ideas. The reality is that in Tunisia there, and I don't profess to be an expert in Tunisia, but there, at least from a distance, it does appear that there is more of an awareness of a societal sense of what things like individual liberties mean, a sense of that national citizenship. In Egypt, for a variety of reasons, many of which can be, much of the blame can be cast on the previous regime and system of 60 years, and all sorts of things can be blamed on that. And in a sense, Islamism is filling in that here and saying, well, national identity is first and foremost Islamic, and then other people can be included in other things. That set of ideas is what I think most importantly needs to be addressed. It's the only thing that can begin to change things from the ground up in Egyptian society.
Well, thank you all for coming, and I want to thank Professor Mead in particular for coming all the way down to Washington to speak to us today, and please join me in thanking all of our panelists.